I'm Robert Heimer from the Yale Departments of Epidemiology and Public Health and Pharmacology at Yale University. I'm going to talk to you about methamphetamine, its mechanism of action, addiction, and treatment. Methamphetamine is a stimulant drug that affects several different systems in the brain. It affects brain signaling in the reward pathway, for which the important molecule in the brain is called dopamine. It also affects the sympathetic nervous system, and the important molecule there is called norepinephrine. Its effect on the reward pathway is the one that is responsible for causing addiction. The reward pathway works sort of in the following way and is stimulated every time we have a pleasurable experience. Eating food, having sex, engaging in exercise. The stimulus comes into this part of the brain called the limbic system. And the first cell in the cascade is electrically stimulated. And as a result of that electrical stimulation, dopamine, the neurotransmitter for this reward system, is released from the first cell in the cascade in little packets. Those packets that are inside the cell merge with the end of the cell, cross the synapse, the gap between two nerve cells, and affect and turn on the cell that's across the synapse from the first cell. So dopamine, the cell is stimulated, dopamine is released, and the second cell in turn is stimulated. Dopamine is controlled, and the release is slowed in two ways. One is the dopamine can be metabolized to an inactive compound slowly in the synapse, or dopamine can be reabsorbed into the cell that released it and recollected in these little packages. Methamphetamine interferes with this reabsorption, this reuptake of dopamine in two ways. One is it slows or it interferes with the reuptake of dopamine into the cell, and it also interferes with the repackaging of dopamine. As a result, more dopamine ends up in the synapse. The downstream nerve cell is turned on for longer periods of time, and with it, one experiences a heightened state of pleasure or euphoria. It's all well and good sometimes to experience, heightened euphoria and pleasure, but methamphetamine interferes with normal functioning of the brain in several ways. First, by having only one mechanism left to diminish the dopamine effect, people who administer a lot of methamphetamine at any one time experience dopamine depletion, which leads to inability to feel pleasure at all, which is what happens oftentimes to people who have binged and taken a lot of methamphetamine over a period of many days. But in the longer run, it can also interfere with the entire signaling system, leading to the need to take more methamphetamine to release the same amount of dopamine, and in turn leading to the feeling that unless you have methamphetamine in the system, you're not normal, you're not able to respond normally, you're not able to feel pleasure normally, which leads to dependence. And if dependence reaches the point where you continue to engage in taking drugs, despite the negative consequences, that dependence has become an addiction. So methamphetamine has the potential to be an addictive drug. The problem becomes, how do we treat this problem once it becomes an addiction? It's complicated because we do not have any reasonable pharmacological means of treating methamphetamine addiction. Unlike heroin, where we have methadone and other substitution therapy drugs that work for stabilizing people who become dependent upon and addicted to heroin. We do not have any such drugs yet for methamphetamine. Two approaches to developing drugs to treat methamphetamine addiction have been developed. The first is to take what's called an antagonistic approach, to find drugs that block the effect of methamphetamine and related compounds. We have identified drugs that, in naive users, people who don't have much experience with methamphetamine, are able to make these people who are treated with this drug before they're administered methamphetamine not feel the methamphetamine effect. The problem is in experienced users who want to feel the methamphetamine effect, these drugs seem to only make people want to take more methamphetamine. So clinical trials with drugs like these have found that experienced methamphetamine users treated with these drugs that block the feeling of methamphetamine actually go out and take more drug. So that approach doesn't work. Then, in comparison or analogously to what we've done with methadone as treatment for heroin addiction, we've tried to find an agonist drug that interacts with the reward pathway in the same way, but it doesn't produce the long-term negative effects. Now, we've tried to do that with several drugs that we know stimulate the systems of the brain that are also stimulated by methamphetamine. Most of these drugs are stimulant drugs of one kind or another, and unfortunately these don't seem to work either. The problem may be that we really don't have the right target drugs yet. We don't have enough experimentation going on to find drugs that would work with the right receptors in the brain of people who become dependent upon methamphetamine. It might be that we simply aren't spending enough money to look for these drugs. Much of the research in this is being done by labs at U.S. National Institutes of Health or in university academic settings. There hasn't been any big push by the big pharmaceutical companies to look for a drug, to spend money on research and development to find such a drug. So maybe if we spent more money, we could find the appropriate drugs that would begin to give us a pharmacologic tool to successfully treat methamphetamine addiction the same way we can use methadone or other long-acting opiates to treat heroin addiction. Since we don't have a pharmacological tool, we find ourselves relying on psychotherapeutic tools to treat methamphetamine addiction after people have gone through detoxification and withdrawal from methamphetamine. And this detoxification can be painful, discomforting, should probably be done under medical supervision. But once the patient has successfully gotten the methamphetamine out of his system, it doesn't mean he's no longer craving the drug, no longer wants to take the drug, because the drug, the way the reward system works is it not only has immediate effect of making you feel pleasure, it also works on memory, so that you remember the pleasure, you remember that you want it, and under certain conditions, the wanting of the drug can be so overwhelming that people relapse and go back to using methamphetamine, even though they no longer have any in their system. Therefore, there is this cycle for methamphetamine users of binging. The methamphetamine results in dopamine depletion, crashing, and a feeling of lack of pleasure. Then after a while, the system restores itself a little bit. People take methamphetamine again to experience the pleasure, and I go through these cycles of taking the drug, experiencing the pleasure, withdrawing, and then resuming use again in a pattern that eventually compromises their ability to engage in meaningful and productive lives. So we want to find a way around that. So after the person has been withdrawn from the drug, we try psychological counseling. Different approaches have been tried that are more or less successful in treating methamphetamine addiction. Currently, the best method we have for psychotherapeutic intervention to deal with methamphetamine addiction is something called contingency management, which in some ways is just a fancy way of saying we pay people to stay clean. We give them a reward, usually a monetary reward of some kind, for coming into our treatment clinic, for providing a urine or a hair sample that is negative for methamphetamine, and if a series of such samples are produced, then we give them a reward. We bank the reward, which they can collect at any time. You would think that this approach, contingency management, would require unimpaired cognition for drug users to understand that they're going to be rewarded. And there is this belief that methamphetamine addiction, long-term methamphetamine use, results in the impairment of the ability to think properly. Well, a recent careful review of the literature has determined that there is no convincing evidence that there is long-term cognitive impairment in drug users. So they're perfectly capable of understanding what's being offered to them when they're offered contingency management payment in return for clean urines. But then there's the issue of impulse control. Now, we often think of addiction as a disease of impulse and problems with impulse control. So what's fascinating is some of the findings about how contingency management works. Now, there are two things you can do with the payment you get in contingency management. You can continue to accumulate it, or you can take it and you can spend it. Now, you would think that someone who has impulse control problems would take their payment, and that those people would also be the most likely to continue to use methamphetamine because they can't control their impulses. But it turns out that this is absolutely not what happens. It's the exact opposite. That the people who take the money they've earned through contingency management and spend it actually have fewer dirty urines, they stay cleaner longer, they have fewer relapses. This study is done in the United States in a controlled clinical trial. I wonder if a similar clinical trial should be conducted in Vietnam to see if the Vietnamese behave the same way as the Americans do. It certainly would be an interesting cultural study. There's no reason to think that the biology is any different between people in the United States and people in Vietnam. We're all human beings. We're all very closely related. The structure, the wiring of our brains is very, very similar, if not identical. So the question is there some cultural issue about people who become addicted in the United States that leads the people who are willing to spend their earnings to be engaged in fewer relapses, have fewer relapses, that is different from how people in Vietnam might react? Be a very interesting clinical study to conduct here. But because we don't have very many other successful interventions, either no pharmacological ones and very few psychological ones, it's worth trying contingency management on a large scale here and then finding out whether or not it works.